Step inside verified souls. Tonight you are not just a viewer, but the keeper of the midnight watch. As the world sleeps and the highways darken, you're invited to join a circle of those brave enough to listen to what the shadows whisper. Every story you hear here is a thread binding our community of night watchers and seekers of the truth behind closed doors. As you settle in, know that you're among allies, each one daring enough to face the unknown together. Ready yourself, because the night shift begins now, and with each new subscriber, our circle grows even stronger against whatever waits beyond the cold glass. Let me take you to a place most drivers speed past with nothing but the faint glow of buzzing neon overhead. A place where boredom is the enemy, and the ticking of the wall clock somehow gets louder after midnight. Picture it with me. A shell station off I-40 in rural Oklahoma, surrounded on all sides by fields dark as spilled oil. You can't see 20 feet past the parking lot, and the only company you have between 1 and 4 in the morning is the tired hum of refrigerators fighting back against the summer heat. They say it's the safest spot for miles, but that safety feels tissue thin when there's nobody else around. Now, I wasn't new to the night shift. Not really. 6 months in, I'd developed a routine that played out the same every night. Stock the cooler, wipe down the counters, banter with truckers if they happened to roll in, then settle behind the register and count time by the arrival of my regulars. There's comfort in routine, especially when the world outside is asleep. But you know how patterns go. When something breaks them, it never feels right. That's where the man with the nickels came in. I can still hear the clink of his coins against the Formica countertop. He'd shuffle in, always after 2, always alone, pale, short, and awkward in the way he moved, like every gesture had been practiced for years. He never spoke except to ask for a drink. He'd stare at the fridge, sometimes for 10 minutes straight, like he was waiting for it to blink back. Then he'd slide open the door, slowly, carefully, grab a single bottle of Mountain Dew, and step to the register. He'd pay in nickels and dimes, always the exact amount, like he counted it out beforehand. At first I thought he was a little odd, but harmless. One of those creatures of habit you see when the sun's gone down and everyone else's defenses have dropped. My brain filled in the blanks. Maybe he was struggling financially. Maybe this was how he made life manageable. People need patterns, right? But after a few weeks, the pattern itself became alarming. He never bought anything different, didn't react to my jokes about living on Mountain Dew, never looked me in the eye. And every transaction was surrounded by profound silence. The only sound, the squeal of the cooler door, and the metallic song of coins pinging off the countertop. Then one night, it changed. I remember the way the station looked that evening, foggy outside, the kind that makes the security lights look blurry and strange. I just finished cleaning the coffee pot when I felt the first tremor of disturbance. He came in, but this time he didn't hesitate, didn't stare at the fridge. Instead, he walked straight to the snacks and began pulling bags off the racks. Chips, cookies, jerky, things he'd never touched before. Then he grabbed 4 bottles of Mountain Dew, arms full, eyes locked straight ahead. He dropped everything in a heap on the counter and reached into his jacket, revealing not the usual handful of nickels, but crisp $50 bills. Just like that. His silence was heavier than ever. He pressed the money into my palm, fingers cold and rigid, and didn't wait for change. The transaction lasted seconds, yet felt stretched out impossibly in time. The door chimed as he left, and the bell sounded different somehow, distorted, as if echoing off something other than glass. I watched him cross the parking lot, bags swinging at his sides. Not once did he look back. I didn't think much of it at first, other than being relieved at the extra cash. But when my shift ended, something gnawed at me. A question with no words attached. Why had he changed? What triggered the break in the ritual? The next night, the world snapped back into place. He returned at his usual time, dressed the same, moving the same, and bought a single Mountain Dew with a handful of nickels, like nothing happened. I tried to joke, to reference his splurge, but he only repeated his order and stared past me, eyes foggy, mouth unmoving. The bags from last night were gone. He paid, took his drink, left. But that night, as I swept the floor, replaying the change in routine, I noticed something strange. There was a small piece of paper taped beneath the register, a torn strip with handwriting so shaky I could barely make out the words, "Keep quiet, he sees." I felt a chill race up my spine. Had someone come in while I wasn't looking? Or had he left it as a warning? I turned it over in my mind as I checked the security cameras. Nothing but him, moving in ordinary loops, never lingering. But it didn't feel ordinary anymore. Some part of me was now convinced I had witnessed something important. A signal, a message, or a ritual I was never meant to understand. From then on, every time he entered, I watched closer, listening for patterns, for slips. The coins made me cringe. The silence made my heartbeat thud in my ears. People talk about encounters with weird customers, with robbers or addicts or the mentally ill. But there's a different category, those whose routines don't make sense, who seem to know something you don't, who operate on rules the rest of us aren't privy to. Months later, I learned through local talk that a man matching his description had been found wandering down the interstate, delusional, speaking in riddles about needing the right transaction to keep things balanced. They say he vanished after that, nowhere to be found. That was all I got. No answers, just a lingering dread, and the memory of him breaking the routine that had become my anchor. If you ever work nights, pay attention to the ones who break the pattern. Sometimes they're not just passing time. Sometimes they're performing something only they, and whatever follows them out of the darkness, truly understand. And sometimes, as you count out nickels in the neon-lit emptiness, you realize you're not alone, not even with the doors locked and the cameras pointed your way. You're just another part of the story. And the scariest thing is, that story rarely ends when the sun comes up. Let me invite you into a different kind of cold, the kind that seeps through double-pane glass and into your marrow long before you realize you're being watched. Have you ever sat somewhere so quiet you could hear your heart thumping, the fluorescent lights humming above you like a swarm that won't die down, and wondered if you really were alone? That's the place I lived in for nearly a year, a BP gas station north of Duluth, Minnesota, perched at the edge of what locals call the old logging fog. The entire station sits in a basin of winter black, the lake wind curling against glass storefront panes so tall you feel exposed every time you step up to mop or count inventory. Everyone has a story they tell themselves to get through the shift. I told myself the odds were on my side, that scary things only happened in bigger towns and busier stations, and that most folk out here shared my weariness. But the night that woman appeared, I stopped believing in odds. It was after 3, the hour the fast food joints had closed. Long-haul truckers retreated to their rigs, and even the sheriff's office rolled by only once per hour. I was stretching my back behind the register, watching the fog thicken against the glass, trying not to stare at my own reflection. That's when the bell chimed, soft, as if someone nudged it with their elbow instead of foot or shoulder. I expected a half-drunk regular, or maybe one of the road crew. Instead, she shuffled in wearing thin pajamas, bottoms far too long, dragging across the tile, and a battered coat with the hood pulled up tight. She moved like an afterthought, like she wasn't meant to be there at all. She didn't offer a greeting, only muttered under her breath, something twisted and low I couldn't catch. I watched her choose a bottle of water and a pack of gum, all the while muttering, pausing, muttering more. Her hands trembled as she paid, coins rattling on the counter, her face hidden behind the shadow of that hood. Maybe she was sick, I figured, or freezing. I tried to wish her warmth as she vanished into the fog. But it wasn't a normal night, and she wasn't gone. About an hour later, I heard the thud, a flat, wet sound against the glass facing the empty lot. I spun, mop handle tightening in my grip, and saw her palm splayed on the window, face pressed close, breath fogging the pain. But it was the laughter that undid me, a brittle sound, like someone choking on a joke they'd forgotten the punchline to. She stood there and laughed, mouth stretching and twisting, eyes encased in darkness. I could feel the muscles in my legs twitch, torn between running and freezing. You ever get so scared your skin feels too small for your body? That's where I was, standing in the buzz of neon and bleach fumes, the only barrier between me and her, that thin sheet of glass. She didn't leave. For 45 minutes she paced the front panels, sometimes pressing her hand flat against the window, other times tracing her fingers along the frame. I crouched behind the counter, watching through the displays. Each time the laughter bubbled up, it felt closer, more insistent. It echoed through the mop bucket I dropped, cutting through the humming silence like a razor. I tried calling for help, but the cell signal flickered, just static, no voices, no connection. Looking outside, the world was erased by fog, no headlights, no passing cars, only her and her laughter, bouncing off empty parking lines. After what felt like an eternity, she drifted away into the mist, leaving me clutching the mop like a lifeline, heart pounding, sweat cold against my skin despite the tears running down my cheek. I waited for the cop shift. When the cruiser finally swung by 20 minutes later, I could barely explain. Couldn't even get the words out past the adrenaline and fear biting my tongue. But here's what nobody tells you. Terror doesn't always leave when the threat's gone. She started coming back, sometimes just passing by in the early morning, sometimes pausing, hands pressed gently to the glass, laughter muted. But always there, like she wanted me to know she hadn't forgotten. The store became a cage. Every time the fog rolled in, I'd twitch at every phantom shadow, every shift of wind. I learned to listen for the laugh before it began, to recognize its rhythm under the hum of lights and ice machine. Sleep became a luxury I lost interest in. Even when days stretched on routinely, nights never returned to normal. Some people think horror is a burst, a single sudden moment. But I learned that some terror doesn't need violence or explanation. Sometimes it's a shape in the night, tangled hair brushing glass, a sound too close for comfort, echoing your private thoughts while everyone else sleeps. Sometimes it's knowing someone, or something, remembers you, wants to haunt you, maybe even needs you for reasons you'll never understand. Years later, when I pass that station on my way into town, I feel my breath catch. Nobody remembers the woman in pajamas. Nobody speaks about laughter in the fog. But as the mist curls against my windshield, I know she's waiting, somewhere out beyond the headlights watching, always ready to press her hand to the glass and remind me, and now you, just how thin safety really is when you're alone and the world pretends not to see what's staring right in. There are nights when reality slips, just a little, like the edge of a dream you can't remember unless someone whispers it in your ear. If you're listening close, if you're ready, let me show you how thin that curtain really is, especially inside a gas station cage, where safe is just another word for separated from whatever's outside. I'd only been working at the Citgo on Route 66 a few weeks, but already I felt like I'd landed in another world. The place is old, worn tiles, half the lights too dim, and a security cage bolted around the register, the kind that makes it feel like you're serving time while you sell snacks. You buzz people in manually after midnight. It's not exactly a friendly setup, but after the stories I'd heard from other stations, I was grateful for a barrier that I could trust, even if it was only steel mesh instead of bulletproof glass. My shift started out like any other. The parking lot stretched empty, bathed in bug-zapped neon, and inside the only sounds were the refrigerator's hum and my own footsteps ticking off the minutes. I was organizing receipts, trying to figure out how a place with such little traffic could have so much paperwork. When the odd stuff began, It started simple. I pressed the buzzer to let a customer in, heard the click and the faint groan of the old door, but when I looked up, the store was still empty. I chalked it up to habit. Maybe I'd pressed the buzzer accidentally. Maybe a bird had flown past outside and gotten picked up by the sensor. But a few minutes later, I did it again. The same feeling crept in. A jolt, like when you forget if you locked your front door or not. I swept around the aisles, double-checking the corners, and found nobody. But the bathroom door was wide open, and inside the smell was unbearable, rank, sharp, mixed with something rotten and old. On the stall door, smeared across the painted metal, was a streak of filth I don't dare describe in detail, but you could see it was purposeful, twisted into shapes. Or maybe that was just my mind grasping for sense. I dashed back to the register to rewind the security tapes, hands shaking between disgust and confusion. The videos told me nothing, just me and the empty aisles, the slow crawling seconds, sometimes the flash of headlights outside that never amounted to a real arrival. I'd unlock the door, sure, but no one had come in, not that the camera or my eyes could see. The rest of the shift crawled. Bottles sat on shelves like silent witnesses, and after that bathroom incident, I made it a point to check the cameras every hour. Same story. Just me. Alone. But that was the kind of alone that doesn't comfort. The kind that makes you question whether you missed something. An edge of shadow. A hitch in sound. Then came the second night. I braced myself, determined not to be spooked by tricks of the mind or bad plumbing. The air felt heavy. Thunderstorms, promised by the radio, but only a dry static buzzing above the counter. Toward 2 a.m, I heard them. Bottles clattering, a cluster falling at once in the far aisle. Loud enough to shock me out of my seat. I ran to see. Broken glass, sticky soda crawling across tile. No sign of anyone. No alarms on the door. No motion on the cameras. Just the ghost of my own reflection in the mesh. I grabbed a mop and started cleaning up, but every stroke made me feel watched, like something pressed close to the inside of my skull, waiting. When I checked the footage again, same result. Bottles just toppled, as if nudged by invisible wind. That night, I called the local police, tried to sound sane about what I'd found. They came, polite but unconvinced, did the rounds, shone their flashlights into the corners. "You're alone," they told me, almost as if reassuring themselves. "Try to get some air. Walk out back for a bit." I did, but standing outside in the hush, I realized it felt no less crowded, the darkness brushing against the canopy lights with a weight you can almost smell. By my 4th night, I started keeping records, writing down every time I heard a sound. Every door that opened, every change in the air. Patterns didn't emerge. Nothing lined up on the tape, nothing matched on the clock. But every night, the bathroom would stink, stall doors left propped open, and in some moments, when I turned away from the cage, I felt sure, absolutely sure, I wasn't alone. People talk about haunted places like they're dramatic, full of blood and demons and things that scream in your ear. But I think sometimes, real haunting is much quieter. The kind you can't prove. The kind that leaves you doubting if you're just plain losing your grip. It's in the space between moments. It's in the certainty that what you see on camera is never the whole truth. A week before I quit, I finally caught something. Going through the tapes at 4 a.m., I froze a frame, watched as my own shadow stretched across the aisles. Just me, cleaning, bored, tired. Then, 2 seconds where the screen flickered. Static wiped across one corner, the pixel door warped like water, and for the briefest instant, a shape, barely there, moved behind me. Not a person, not an animal, a distortion, a cold blur that made the tiles ripple and the bottled drinks shake on their shelves. It lasted a moment, then snapped back, video cutting clear again. I never saw it live, never heard it. But that night was the last time I unlocked the door after midnight. I left my badge on the counter and never returned. If you're listening now, if you're working nights, remember this. Safety from the outside is only half the story. Sometimes, what's inside, what's quiet, what wears the shape of nothing at all, is the nightmare that locks you in, buzzes in your wires, wipes itself from the tapes. You may think you're alone, shielded by doors and security cages, but when reality slips, all it takes is 1 second, one static laced frame, and you'll question whether you were ever really by yourself. And I promise you that uncertainty is enough to keep you company far longer than any customer ever could. Let's shift into an uneasy warmth, the kind that makes sweat bead on your skin, even in the dead of night, and turns every movement sticky. Phoenix, Arizona, roasts all day and smolders all night, especially in the outlying patches where freeway lights flicker and the hum of distant traffic sounds more like a warning than a lullaby. The 76 gas station where I spent my summer was a dust-blown outpost barely clinging to the edge of civilization. Nothing but harsh fluorescent glow, tired floor tiles, and the lingering hope that daylight would always come as scheduled. I signed on for the graveyard shift between college semesters, chasing the promise of overtime and the illusion of work that felt safe. What nobody tells you is that night shifts have their own gravity. Strange rules, stranger interruptions. People get thirsty, lost, frantic. Sometimes the heat addles their brains. You prepare for weird, ridiculous moments you'll laugh about later, but every so often, weird gets sharper, harsher. Sometimes it's not paranormal at all, just a force of human wildness breaking through, contagious as fever. It started slow for me, building up until the walls seemed to sweat tension. That night, even the AC struggled against thick air. The storefront smelled faintly of burnt rubber and diesel, familiar but almost smoky. I wiped down the counter, restocked the coolers, texting my mom to remind her that I'd missed dinner. Again. Time crawled, my boredom mounting in waves. Then, just past 1, a heavy-set man lurched in from the haze outside. Wild hair, eyes glassy but fierce, chest heaving as if he'd run a marathon across hot asphalt. He wore a torn shirt, jeans crusted with dirt, and his shoes were missing. I barely had time to greet him before he asked with a kind of desperate sincerity, "You know where to find God around here?" His voice cut through me, raw and broken, tangled up in sadness and something darker. I tried to stall, mumbling about churches a few blocks away, but he didn't react. He walked straight to the cooler, yanked the door open, grabbed a 2-liter bottle of Mountain Dew, twisted off the cap, and guzzled half of it before I could mention payment. I reached for the phone, more nervous now, trying to figure out the right mix of politeness and caution. Every step he took felt calculated, yet helpless, like a storm ready to crack in any direction. Nearby, the lights buzzed and popped. My knuckles went white, gripping the edge of the counter. With a sudden burst, he staggered back, tore off his shirt, and dropped his jeans and underwear right there on the tiles. Just as he started to wail, a raw, gut-deep sound, he collapsed onto the floor, limbs sprawled like a marionette cut loose. He rolled onto his back, urinating on himself, eyes wide open to the ceiling. I froze. There's a kind of fear that's not about ghosts or murderers, but the recognition that you are face to face with someone who's truly lost, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I called the police and described what was happening, my voice barely steady enough to get the words out. They said help was coming, but that it'd be 20 minutes. Too few cops, too much dessert, not enough help for anyone lost out here. I tried to keep my distance, the sticky heat mixing with the sweet scent of spilled soda and the bitter smell of urine. Time twisted. The man began rambling, his words running together, something about demons, God, the heat, how the road had betrayed him. I watched from behind the donut rack, knees shaking, conscious that my job had not prepared me for this kind of emergency. The lights flickered overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, but here, In this cramped stretch of tile and plexiglass, the only sound was the man's voice, rising and falling, tears streaming freely to meet the sweat and filth. Finally, the police arrived. 2 officers with more concern in their eyes than I'd seen all summer. They helped him up, wrapping him in a blanket, whispering words too gentle for the situation. They told me later that he'd been off his medication for days, that he'd broken into a church nearby, smashing windows, and leaving behind a trail of chaos, searching for salvation he couldn't find in the desert air. As they led him away, I stared at the sticky mess on the floor, heart still racing. I cleaned it slowly, the hum of the cooler and the distant police radio chatter mixing with my thoughts. There's trauma in witnessing someone's deepest unraveling, and it sticks with you, colors every late shift with doubt and dread. You leave those nights changed, not because you met a monster, but because you learned how thin the barrier is between order and breakdown, sanity and something else. Sometimes real horror isn't what stalks you from the shadows, but what falls apart right in front of you under 2 bright lights, surrounded by snacks and soda bottles. You realize how fragile safety is, how quickly routine can shatter, and how the question of where to find God isn't always rhetorical when someone's standing naked, lost, and desperate at 1 a.m., seeking shelter from a world that's forgotten how to help. Some nights you see spirits, some nights you see storms, and some nights the worst thing that walks through your doors is another human soul whose story almost became a headline, saved for now by the patience of strangers and the light that barely holds back the dark. If you've ever worked the graveyard shift, you know how the darkness outside the glass can start to feel alive, like it's pressing closer with every passing hour. But there's a deeper layer to the night, a texture to the silence that most folks will never know. A silence cut not by the roar of an engine or the slam of a door, but by the smallest, nastiest details you only notice when exhaustion turns your senses raw. Let me tell you about the night the darkness came crawling in at ground level, and how one encounter at a Texaco in the Detroit suburbs left marks I'll never scrub away. I wasn't alone on this shift, not in the way you're probably thinking. My mother was in the back, sleeping on a cot behind the office partition. She'd picked up a double shift after her regular job cleaning offices downtown. Money was tight. Tighter than I knew back then, so she brought me to the station on nights when she had no one else to watch me. Most kids would have found it boring, hours of nothing but the drone of coolers and the smell of stale candy. But to me, it was a safe pocket in a dangerous world, a cocoon of fluorescent light and sugary bribes, the 2 of us together, her snoring gently 5 feet away. It had rained that day, and the oily puddles outside gleamed under the parking lot lights. The air smelled of gasoline and wet pavement. All the customers had faded away hours earlier, leaving behind half-empty tanks and cold footprints in the mud. I was dozing beneath the counter, wrapped in my favorite hoodie when something, a faint scraping noise, or maybe just a shift in atmosphere, pulled me awake. At first, I thought my mother was stirring, but her breathing was steady. The digital clock on the wall glared 4:19 a.m., numbers too bright. My mouth was dry, the kind of dry that only comes from nerves, not thirst. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, followed by a gentle knock at the glass door. Barely a tap, hesitant, almost apologetic. I peeked out and saw a shape moving just beyond the spill of yellow light, hunched low to the ground. The door chimed when he entered, even though it never should have. We always locked it at 3. He must have been waiting nearby, or maybe the lock had failed. Either way, there he stood, an older man whose outline was more hair and rags than human, clothes so filthy and shredded they looked glued to his skin. The first thing I noticed was his smell, a thick sour mix that hit me before I could even see his eyes. But what stuck with me, the detail that has never truly left me, were the moving bulges writhing beneath his jacket. I'll be honest with you, I froze. A kid in the dark, suddenly aware he wasn't as hidden as he hoped. The man looked around, eyes pink and watery, then staggered up to the counter, clutching at the laminate like it would tether him to the world. He tried to speak, but all I heard was a hoarse croak, so dry I could almost feel it in my own throat. I wanted to call for my mother, but my voice wouldn't work. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the sticky tile. That's when it happened. Something squirmed out from beneath his jacket, small, covered in wet gray fur. A rat big as my hand dropped from his body and landed with a dull, sickening thud right in front of the register. For a split second, it just sat there, twitching, red eyes darting under the harsh glare. Then it scurried in a circle, as if confused, before coming to a halt at my shoe. Everything tightened inside me. I held my breath. The rat lifted its nose, searching, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, it slumped over on its side. Dead. Not dramatically. No last twitch, no movie scream, just stillness. It was like it had carried its last secret as far as it could, and the journey ended on that cracked, stained tile. The man swayed, eyelids fluttering, and tried to pick the rat up. His fingers trembled, and he whispered a word I couldn't make out. A name, maybe, or just a sound meant only for himself. His hands were covered in sores, fingers swollen and raw, half-moon cuts under each dirty nail. If you've ever seen the way neglect can unravel a body faster than time, you know the kind of misery I'm describing. By now, my mother had stirred, sensing the wrongness. She stepped out of the back, the look on her face shifting instantly from fatigue to terror. She grabbed my arm, hard enough to hurt, and yanked me away from the counter. The man, sensing our fear or maybe just remembering an exit, shuffled toward the door. He cradled the dead rat like a treasure as he left, staring back at us once, lips moving, no sound this time, before vanishing into the pre-dawn gloom. In the silence that followed, my mother locked the door, drew the blinds, and held me as tightly as she could. I could feel her heartbeat through her shirt, staccato, faster than I'd ever felt before. She whispered assurances, but they sounded forced. The smell lingered, impossible to describe, long after he was gone. We called someone, the police or animal control, I'm not sure which. They didn't find him, not that night, not ever. But in the days that followed, I noticed a change in myself, and in my mother too. She started double-checking the locks, never letting me out of her sight. I started flinching at stray noises, shivering even in the July heat. We couldn't look at the corners of the store the same way. The memory of that rat, those sores, and the echo of that lifeless thud had wormed in too deep. People want their horror to be sharp and sudden, always coming from outside, always solved with heroics. What happened that night was smaller, uglier, and somehow worse because of it. Sometimes horror oozes in with the filth, makes you look at other people and see how close all of us are to falling through the cracks. Sometimes it's not about what haunts the building or what spirit stalks the roads, but about the kind of neglect and rot that turns living things, people, and animals into shadows that slip between us unnoticed until it's too late. For months after, I'd wake with that stench in my nose, hear the imagined scraping of claws against plastic, my feet itching to break into a run I could never start. And every now and then, I'd spot a movement beneath a blanket at a bus stop or catch a filthy smile in the corner of my vision and wonder if it was him, if he'd somehow slipped through the tiny cracks in our lives, carrying something lost and poisoned and terribly human. If you ever find yourself working late, remember, not everything that enters through your door is looking for shelter or kindness. Some are searching for something only they can name, dragging their reminders behind them, a scrap of fur, a broken body, a story nobody wants to claim. Lock your doors, draw your blinds, and keep your loved ones close. But above all, be careful what you let in, because some things don't leave, even after the cleanup is done and the lights click off. That rat died at my feet, and the man vanished into the darkness. But I'm still cleaning up what that night left behind. And I know now, deep in my bones, that horror is often quiet, heavy, and crawling, closer to home than you'd ever want to believe. Some nights, horror isn't a scream or a shadow in the wrong place. It's the realization that fate isn't just random, but arbitrary, cruel, and uncomfortably close. There are moments when you witness danger a few feet away and realize you survived not because you were brave or clever, but because on that day, the world chose someone else. This story isn't about what happened inside my station. It's about what didn't, and the thin, trembling line between safety and tragedy. I worked the overnight at an old Exxon station in rural Tennessee. Picture it. 2 identical gas stops split across a lonely highway. Blink and you'll miss a town. Dark fields stretching out to the horizon like an ocean of grass. The air always tasted faintly of diesel, and when the moon was gone, the whole county seemed to melt into one endless black sheet. We called the station across the road the Twin. Same flickering sign, same neon hum, same board routines. 3 years on, you get complacent. I had my patterns. Keep the coffee fresh, check the register, sweep up the summer bugs that died under the lights. I knew my regulars, nodded to truckers pushing through fatigue, and waved to the old-timers who'd stop in for scratch-offs. The other station's crew matched our faces. Same small-town roots, same tired jokes. If the night was slow, you'd swap stories in quick text, promise to meet up for breakfast once the world woke up. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special, halfway through August. I remember the quiet, just the soft drone of crickets, the distant whine of a late train. I leaned on the counter, counting time until my break, when a burst of blue and red exploded across the darkness. Sirens, loud, shattering, rushed past and flooded the lot of the Twin station, painting everything with frantic, pulsing light. At first, I was confused. Accidents happened, sure, but never this loud, never this sudden. I stepped up to the window and watched the spectacle unfold. A half-dozen cruisers, doors open, officers moving fast. The shapes of their flashlights splintered through the dust, while the night air came alive with shouts and crackling radio calls. I reached for my own phone, instinct driving me to check in with the other cashier. But there was no reply, just a hollow silence where our routine used to sit. The world felt brittle then, about to snap. Something had gone wrong, and every instinct inside me screamed not to look, not to open the door, not to step outside. But I couldn't help myself. I was drawn, hypnotized by the chaos just yards away. Minutes crawled. More cars arrived. Ambulances rolled up, sirens dropping to a dull wail as paramedics rushed inside the Twins' bright-lit storefront. I trembled, feeling the seconds stretch tighter and tighter. Every bone in my body waiting for a sound, a shout, for someone to knock on my door and say it was just a drill, just a mistake. Then came a tidal wave of radio static. The officers, calling in codes I'd heard only in movies, voices taut and clipped. A robbery had gone down. Masked men with guns, quick and brutal, had stormed in from the darkness, cleared the register, and shot the cashier when he hesitated. My counterpart. The guy I'd traded stories with only the day before. No logic, no reason, just a flicker of chance, a line drawn not by anything real, but by circumstance. The robbers had chosen their station, not mine. Their violence sliced through routine with a cold precision you only recognize too late. The news hit like a fist in the gut. I backed away from the window, knees weak, head buzzing with terror and disbelief. I'd been standing in the same pool of neon, breathing the same night air, split from disaster by nothing but the whims of a map and a 2-lane road. For hours, I barely moved. A statue trapped by fear, drowned by guilt, and the sickening knowledge that everything familiar could be wiped away in an instant. Later, when the sun rose and the police interviewed us, I learned the details. The cashier was a young man, 2 weeks on the job, Anxious yet friendly, eager to learn. He'd done everything right. Kept calm, handed over the cash, pressed the panic button. But the robbers panicked, firing a shot before running. One mistake. One moment. I stared at my own register, replaying every shift, every conversation. Every time I told myself, nothing bad ever happens here. In the aftermath, the crew at our station gathered together in shaken silence, each of us searching for comfort in routine. Coffee, clumsy jokes, promises we'd be careful. But a new shadow crept in, invisible but heavy, the sure understanding that safety was a myth. For weeks, I couldn't stop watching the road, flinching at headlights, jumping at minor noises. Survivor's guilt, they call it. A toxic ache, both relief and shame. The taste of fear that doesn't leave with daylight. If you're listening, I need you to believe me. Sometimes horror isn't about monsters or ghosts or any darkness you can measure. It's the randomness of fate. The knowledge that danger doesn't care what doors you lock or routines you keep. It picks, it chooses, it leaves scars. Working those nights changed me. I no longer rest easy behind the register, no longer watch the road without wondering about the lives split by invisible choices. Every siren, every shout, every flash of red and blue is a reminder. You're only safe until you aren't. And sometimes the difference between terror and routine is nothing but the wrong address, the wrong moment, the wrong coin flipped in the dark. Remember this: if you ever find yourself alone at midnight on a deserted highway, lock your doors, stay alert, but know that horror is often a lottery, and all you can do is hope the odds stay in your favor. Just one more night. There's a certain kind of courage that comes from knowing the world is asleep, and all that stands between you and the vast, silent dark is a ring of buzzing lights and a pair of locked glass doors. They tell you the desert is quiet at 3 a.m. But if you've ever worked the night shift at a gas station just outside Las Vegas, you know the quiet is never actually empty. Sometimes it's holding its breath, waiting for one sound to crack the spell. I was a few months into my job at the Chevron by the highway, a station famous for being the closest fuel before the endless stretch. Truckers, gamblers fleeing the city, even night hikers chasing the cool air in their battered Jeeps. I was no stranger to the odd and the unexpected, shouting matches in the lot, prank calls, angry drifters who thought I had their wallet. But the night that things truly went wrong, it all started with a noise far too heavy for the hour. It was a slow night. Traffic had died down, and my head was starting to dip. I busied myself with old routines, wiping down the register, sorting scratchers, tracking the movement of moths in the windows. That's when the sound hit. A sharp metallic banging coming from outside, so abrupt I nearly dropped my stack of receipts. For a moment, every muscle in my body braced for something familiar. A raccoon rummaging near the bins, maybe a kid larking about. But then more thuds, louder, scattered through the empty parking lot. Instinct kicked in, adrenaline spiking. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from beneath the counter, stepped outside beneath the dome of blue-white canopy lights, and scanned the lot. Out past the pools of light, I caught a flash. A figure darting between parked cars, hood drawn low, movements urgent, but not quite panicked. I called out, voice echoing off the surrounding emptiness. No answer, only another sharp bang, this time from the far edge of the lot, where a rusty old sedan sat hunched over broken pavement. I moved closer, the world compressing down to the cone of my flashlight beam and the crunch of gravel below my feet. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow, and the distant hum of highway traffic. Background noise that should have felt comforting but instead sounded like a warning just out of reach. Suddenly, the figure popped up from beside the sedan, frozen in the light like a deer in headlights. He was young, maybe late teens, eyes wide and wild, face pale and drawn. For one electric second, our eyes locked. And I saw something desperate flicker beneath the fear. He bolted, moving fast, shoes skidding on gravel, straight toward the open desert that spilled into the empty spaces behind the station. I yelled again, part challenge and part plea. Without thinking, I took off after him, the distance between us stretching and closing with each erratic stride. My lungs burned, my pulse thundered in my ears, and for a few terrifying moments, I was certain I was making a massive mistake. What if he had a weapon? What if he wasn't just a desperate kid, but a dangerous one? We circled the lot, the sedan serving as our anchor. I got close enough to see he was clutching a screwdriver, face contorted in panic, sweat gleaming under the harsh lights. "Don't," I barked, voice ragged. "Just stop, please." He faltered, stumbled on a patch of broken glass near the curb. For an awful split second, he looked ready to drop the weapon and run, but instead, he spun and darted for the car. The adrenaline in my veins demanded I do something, tackle him, hold him, call the cops again. But the reality of the night, the isolation, the way the world dropped away to leave only me and him in the circle of light, forced caution. He climbed awkwardly over the bumper, fumbled with the lock. I held back, breath steaming in the desert chill, every muscle vibrating. From somewhere, maybe the highway, maybe the side street, red and blue swallowed the yellow light. The police had arrived, tires squealing, floodlights splitting the darkness apart. The kid dove inside the car just as two officers jumped from their vehicle, shouting commands, weapons drawn. He froze. It was like someone hit pause on the entire world. No more crunch of footsteps, no jangling breath, only the hum of a dozen engines and the electric tension of action suspended. The police moved in, voices steady, steps measured. I felt my grip go slack, flashlight dropping to my side. The kid at last surrendered. Wrench dropped to the floor. Officers hauled him out, voice cracking in big, uneven sobs. Later, when it all was said and done and the police gave their accounts, I learned the truth. He was trying to escape an abusive family, had nowhere to go, had tried to steal the rusty sedan for the last ride out of town, fearing what waited for him at both ends of the highway. He didn't want to hurt anyone, was simply scared, cornered, and too young to run any further. I spent the rest of my shift shaking, the world never quite settling into normalcy again. Every sound seemed to echo, the ring of footsteps, the crackle of police radios, the anxious thumping of my own heart. The desert felt bigger that night, empty, but full of secrets. Proof that horror doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes, it's the wild eyes of a kid desperate enough to steal, scared enough to run, broken enough to risk everything for freedom. Months passed, and my nerves finally settled. But with every late hour, every crash in the lot, I remembered that night, the chase, the fear, the compassion I had to muster at the edge of disaster. Working alone in the desert, you expect horror to arrive as something inhuman, something unspeakable. Sometimes, though, just being human is terrifying enough, if you listen closely to the silence outside. If you let yourself feel the pulse of the world at its quietest, you'll learn to pay attention to the desperate, to the hungry, to the wild thumping of hope mixed with fear. Lock your doors, hold your ground, be careful. But never forget that sometimes you are the only lifeline left, and the darkness is never really empty. It's always waiting for the story to begin. If you've ever worked a night shift during a storm, you'll know this feeling. The pounding of rain against the roof, the way thunder rattles the windows, the certainty that out there in the world, something is standing watch while everything familiar is washed away. I never worried about storms. In rural Georgia, they were part of life, just another mood the sky wore when it was feeling fierce. But the marathon station where I worked had its own peculiar relationship with storms. And one night, I learned how dread can build drop by drop, hour by aching hour. That night, the forecast called for heavy rain. A real southern thunderstorm, the kind that floods parking lots and shakes the water out of every old leak in the roof. By midnight, the downpour had arrived in earnest, hammering the awning and, every so often, silencing even my thoughts. The world beyond the yellow-lit pavement disappeared. The only thing left was the glow inside the store, the hiss of the coffee pot, and the constant angry patter of rain. I always tried to stay busy, restocking shelves, running tallies at the register, making my way through the tedium of the graveyard shift. But once the storm hit full force, every footstep became a statement against the deluge, every task an act of defiance. Still, I wasn't truly afraid, until I saw him for the first time. He stood out in the open, shirtless in the cold, angular arms folded across his chest, eyes fixed on some distant spot the rest of us couldn't see. He wasn't moving. He should have been soaked to the bone, but the puddles at his feet trembled and danced and didn't seem to touch his bare skin. It's one thing to see a lost soul drift through town, but this man was different. A monument in the rain, a warning the weather itself seemed unwilling to challenge. I tried to ignore him, telling myself he was waiting for a ride, that he was numb to the cold, maybe high or confused, or simply determined to prove a point to some god he'd cursed that day. But as the storm wore on and he did not leave, a strange set of possibilities opened up. Was he daring nature itself, or was he keeping watch? For what? Hours passed. The rain thickened. Lightning erupted across the fields, sometimes dazzling the store so brightly it felt as if the outside world had vanished entirely. And every time I looked up, there he was, still motionless, neck craned, arms locked stubbornly in their folding. Customers noticed too, those few brave enough to fill their tanks with thunder rolling overhead. They whispered nervously, shot glances at me, then at him, then left as quickly as they'd come. There's a point in every long night when the familiar becomes strange, when even the details you thought you knew start to twist into questions. That was how I felt about 2 hours into the storm. The man had not flinched, not turned, not shifted his feet. He was a sentinel made of flesh and bone and soaked determination, and something in me recoiled every time I tried to imagine his story. Eventually, it became clear that he wasn't waiting for a ride. He did not respond when I waved, did not react to shouts, to the thunder, or the flickering neon. A deep chill settled over the store, and I found myself watching him more often than the register, alert as a cornered animal. The world beyond the storm had shrunk until only his presence filled the horizon. 3 hours into the downpour, the parking lot started to flood. Water pooled up against the curb, mud swirling in slow, lazy spirals. The man stood closed within a maelstrom, his shoes lost to the puddles. I thought about calling the police or medics, but something held me back, an irrational fear that any intervention would break whatever spell kept him contained, would somehow invite something inside that I wasn't ready to face. The storm finally began to ease, close to dawn. The rain softened, the thunder wandered away. And in those gray, half-lit hours, the world crept back from the brink. Slowly, as if working against every force in his body, the man started to move, one measured step, then another, finally turning his back to me as he walked away, disappearing into the wet gloom that clung to the fields. You might think that was the end, right? Just a lone figure finally moving on, mystery left unsolved. But that sense of unresolved tension lingered, infecting every corner of the station. I found myself haunted not by what he had done, but by the certainty that he'd survived something, resisted something no one else had noticed. Maybe he'd been keeping the storm at bay. Maybe he was marking territory that wasn't meant for anyone else. In the days that followed, customers and co-workers asked about the stranger in the rain. Some claimed to have seen him. Others wondered aloud if he was even real. But I knew he had been. My memory was sharper than the weather, and every thrum of the storm echoed with the certainty that he'd left something behind that no amount of sunshine would clear. What lasts from that night is not an image, but a mood. The tremor of water pounding on the roof, the pulse of lightning in my chest, the sense that every storm has its watcher, and every watcher has their reasons. The horror wasn't violence, wasn't anything supernatural, but was instead the perfection of a mystery, a question posed silently against the chaos of nature, a man who refused to yield until the night itself had given up. So if you ever find yourself working the stormy shift, alone, hidden behind coffee pots and stacks of dusty snacks, look out at the rain and wonder, who is keeping watch? What storms are they holding back? And most of all, what is out there waiting to wash your ordinary night away, drop by drop, until all that remains is the shudder of the unknown, just outside the yellow light. You ever get that crawling itch at the base of your skull, the kind that tells you something's about to go wrong, even when everything around you looks perfectly ordinary? Most people ignore it, but if you work nights at a remote Valero in the fog-soaked hills of rural Oregon, you learn that your instincts are more reliable than the security cameras, more trustworthy than the company-issued training manual taped beside the register. I was a skeptic, the kind of guy who rolled his eyes at ghost stories, shrugged off tales of haunted restrooms or cursed roadways. My shift was business, numbers, schedules, receipts, mundane to the core. Still, there's a part of night work nobody talks about, the way isolation strips you down until nothing's left but nerves, breath, and the thudding rhythm of your own heart. I liked it mostly. I told myself I was smarter than the superstitious, more grounded than the nervous, until the night the cooler changed everything. You can picture the setting, old Valero, neon signs buzzing garishly above the doors, fog curling low in the lot like slow-motion smoke, hours slipping past so quietly you lose track of time. There's comfort in the routine, stocking shelves, monitoring gas pumps, the brief bursts of conversation with passing travelers. Then the world goes quiet, headlights fade, and you're left with nothing but the subtle shifting of the building as it settles into midnight. It was a Tuesday, only unusual for how thick the fog had grown by 1:30 a.m. The shadows rolled right up to the glass. Objects outside faded into the white. I was halfway through counting scratch tickets, letting the hum of the beer cooler lull me into half-awareness, when the chime at the door snapped me awake. In walks a man I'd never seen before. Average height, nondescript dark clothes, face unreadable. He walked the aisles with absent purpose, hands trailing along the racks, never picking anything up, just moving, scanning. You get all kinds late at night, so I kept my attention split. Register, him, doors, fog. It's a rhythm you learn, never letting your guard drift too far, especially with strangers. After several slow circuits of the store, the man stopped by the beverage cooler, a standard glass-doored fridge packed with soda and water. He opened the door, lingering in the cold air, unusually long. I watched, expecting him to grab a drink, maybe loiter for a minute before checking out. Instead, he did something I still struggle to explain. He put one foot inside the cooler, then the other, his body slanting sideways as he squeezed between the shelves. Arms pressed close, head ducked painfully low. Bottles clattered, shelves creaked. He kept pushing, ignoring the obvious discomfort, contorting with an unnatural, eerie determination. For a moment, I thought he was having a medical episode, maybe a seizure or an attempt to cool off from the fog, but the way he moved, purposeful and silent, defied any explanation I could untangle. I approached cautiously, adrenaline starting to burn in my blood. "Hey man, you need help?" I asked, trying to sound tough but not hostile. He didn't answer, didn't even look at me. His breathing was slow, audible, as if he was concentrating on forcing his body through the impossible gap between shelf and glass. The physical limits screamed for him to stop. The shelf pressed hard into his ribs, soda cans toppling, cooler alarm beeping as cold air spilled out. Still, he persisted, eyes locked on a space beyond the back of the fridge. Some point I couldn't see, or maybe didn't want to. Panic started to bubble. Was he high, having a breakdown, playing some twisted prank? Every scenario I conjured felt less likely, more sinister. My nerves screamed at me to call for backup, for police, for anyone who could make sense of the bizarre tableau unfolding in my cooler. After several agonizing minutes, the man paused, body quivering, pressed so tightly in the fridge door that sweat began to bead on his neck, despite the frigid temperature. For a split second, I caught his eye, wide, unblinking, pupils dilated so much there was barely an iris left. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, but only a faint rasp emerged, a sound like wind whistling across broken glass. Then, just as suddenly as he'd started, he relented. He straightened, stumbled backward, wiped his brow, and left the cooler wide open. He didn't look at me as he walked past, didn't apologize, didn't pause at the register. He exited, the chime at the door ringing its flat approval, vanishing into the fog outside before I could process what I'd witnessed. Shaken, I closed the cooler, reset the alarm, started restacking fallen bottles. But the chill persisted, not in the air, but in my bones. Something about that moment had bent the logic of the night. I wanted to laugh at myself, write it off as just another story for the break room. But as the hours peeled away, I kept glancing toward the cooler, expecting to see him again, or maybe the imprint of his form lingering on the glass. When my co-worker arrived for the morning shift, I tried to explain, fumbling for words that wouldn't sound ridiculous. He patched together some guesses: drugs, mental illness, sleepwalking, a dare gone too far. But neither of us could shake the peculiar certainty that what I saw was an act neither fully random nor remotely sensible. Night after night, I watched the cooler's alarm. Sometimes it went off for no reason, the beeping slicing through silence. Sometimes, as the fog crept in, I imagined shapes moving in the glass, distorted, stretched, contorted like the stranger, limbs warped in the greenish gloom. It would have been easy to convince myself it was just trauma, just nerves. Yet the feeling never dissolved, the story never settled into normalcy. I asked around. None of the other workers remembered anyone matching the description, or at least nobody who'd tried to climb into the cooler. A couple regulars said they'd heard similar stories in other towns. People compelled, in the grip of something they couldn't resist, to slip through spaces that shouldn't fit their bodies, chasing whatever waited on the other side. Superstition, maybe, or urban legend. But the uncanny truth hummed quietly beneath their words. Soon rumors flared up. Folks saying the cooler was cursed, that strange things happened in Valeros built on certain patches of land, places where the fog settled thickest. I didn't buy into it, but the nagging tension never left. Sometimes, late and alone, you sense patterns beneath weirdness. Connections that don't make sense but refuse to dissolve. The experience changed the way I moved through the store, how I trusted my own skepticism. I watched every late-night customer with new caution, ready for something inexplicable nestled beneath their ordinary routines. Sometimes, just before dawn, I caught myself looking at the coolers, half expecting to see an arm, a foot, a face pressed against the glass, someone searching for an escape, for a portal, for the final answer to whatever question had obsessed them in the dark. But horror, I realized, isn't always about threat. Sometimes it's about the mind slipping gears, the body becoming a tool for longing or obsession that can never be satisfied. The man in the cooler came to embody every fear I'd ignored, the possibility that normalcy is only as strong as we insist, and that beneath the surface of quiet routine, wildness waits. So here's my truth. Skepticism is a shield, but sometimes it becomes a blindfold, numbing you to the edges of the possible. That night, I learned to respect the boundaries of glass, of flesh, of sanity, and to question every explanation that fit too neatly. If you ever find yourself alone at 1:30 a.m., with fog blanketing the world outside, remember, There are corridors into the unknown that do not resemble stories, do not explain themselves, do not knock politely before entering. Sometimes they crack open, wide enough for a stranger to try squeezing through, desperate to reach the place only they can see. And if you're working nights, when the silence feels thick and the routine feels safe, watch the cooler doors, watch the shadows in the fog, listen to your instincts. Because sometimes what's coming for you doesn't want to hurt you. Sometimes it just wants to get through, to prove that the rules you've built your life around are just frost on the glass, waiting for someone else to press against them and change everything forever. Let me ask you a question and be honest. Have you ever had that odd, icy moment where time slips, memory stutters, and for one split second you're not sure if what just happened really happened? Maybe it's that feeling of déjà vu. Maybe it's returning to a room and swearing something's off. The clock ticks louder, the air feels thinner, a detail's changed, and you're the only one who notices. Some people shrug it off or chalk it up to being tired. But if you work the lonely graveyard shift at a gas station cut off by endless Nebraska cornfields, as I did, you learn there are nights when reality doubles back on itself. Nights when, even with all the lights on, you start to wonder if you're the one being watched. My station sat on I-80, a blink and you'll miss it mobile, the last pit stop for 20 miles in either direction. Each side of the lit oasis stood pressed against a wall of black. In those early morning hours, when the world seemed half-formed, I relied on routine to keep my mind anchored. Sweep, check the till, count cigarette packs, chase out thoughts of the dark pressing in at the windows. It was around 4 a.m. on a Wednesday that things started getting strange. My regular, an old local named Ray, retired trucker, always in a blue flannel, heavy on the coffee and light on conversation, wandered in as usual. He muttered something about corn prices, bought his favorite scratch-off ticket and a black coffee, paid with exact change, and left after giving me that familiar courteous nod. I went back to inventory, boredom dulling my senses. Not 15 minutes later, the bell chimed again. I glanced up, and my heart gave a weird little lurch. Ray walked in again. Same defeat in his posture, same shuffled steps, but something wasn't right. His hair looked messy in a different way. The flannel had shifted, red instead of blue. He mumbled, this time about his back pain, and bought a bottled water and a pack of gum. I watched in stunned silence as he paid, gave me that same nod, and walked out. I looked at the door, then to the clock, then to my logbook. 2 receipts, 2 signatures. But the times didn't line up the way they should. The first said 4:11, the second 4:20. But my memory insisted he'd only just left. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he'd stopped outside, changed his shirt, felt thirsty, and came back. The mind can play tricks, especially when it's starved of sleep. I shook it off, forced myself to laugh. Made a note in my logbook, something about double Ray, stupid joke to amuse myself on the next break. But the night wouldn't let it go. After dawn, I checked the security tapes just to prove to myself it was nothing. The footage showed Ray coming in, buying his coffee and ticket, leaving. Then, nothing. No second visit, no bottled water, no gum. For nearly 20 minutes, I was alone at the counter, staring at the grainy screen as if it might blink out the truth. My heart hammered in my ears. I tried to ask Ray the next time he came around, joking that he must have been especially thirsty. He looked at me, confusion wrinkling his brow. Didn't come in twice, he said, voice so earnest I could taste the certainty. Just once, just coffee and a ticket same as always. After that, the sense of unreality grew claws. Things shifted subtly each night, patrons repeating words, an item out of place, a register running itself. I'd swear I'd already wiped the counter, only to find fresh coffee rings circling the edge. Sometimes the receipts printed with glitched timestamps. One showed 4:11 twice, stacked right on top of each other, as if time had looped or doubled back. The strangest part was the feeling. It wasn't just spooky, like when you watch a scary movie. It was disorienting, a shiver down the spine that never left. I'd stand there, bathed in the harsh fluorescence, and feel like I was forgetting something crucial. A part of myself left outside, or maybe trailed in by someone else. One night, the phenomenon escalated. A young customer, tourist by the sound of his accent, came through in a rush, bought gas, a donut, and a Red Bull. We chatted about the storm rolling across the fields. 5 minutes later, he was back. Route 80 in the background, paper bag still clutched in his hand, this time acting as if he'd never spoken to me before. In fact, he barely seemed to recognize the store. Again, security footage showed only one visit. The receipt printer stuttered and whirred, the record showing an impossible stack of transactions, all for items I knew I'd only rung up once. I started seeing double everywhere, shadows that didn't match, voices echoing once, then twice. I'd hear footsteps in the storeroom after a customer left, open the door, and find it empty. The metallic jingle of keys would ring, and then, seconds later, ring again as if reality itself was glitching. More than once, customers would look at me, puzzled, and ask, "Did I just come in?" The panic in their eyes matched my own. I talked to other night workers on shift changeover. Some laughed, called me sleep-deprived, a victim of too many horror podcasts. But a few, those with the lines at the corners of their eyes, the ones who'd seen more than their share of silent hours, just nodded with grim sympathy. "It happens sometimes," one said softly. "Things shift out here." Hard to say why. I tried to anchor myself in the tangible, wiping down shelves, making lists, touching each object with purpose so I'd know where reality ended and imagination began. But it didn't help. There'd be mornings when I'd find my own writing doubled, lines repeating across the page, as if two versions of me were trying to leave a record. The breaking point came one Thursday as fog pressed heavy outside, blocking out even the headlights from the highway. The world shrank to a single room, 4 walls, and the glare of yellow light. Around 3:54, a woman entered, pale with a haunted look in her eyes. She paid for gas. 5 minutes later, she reappeared, hair mussed, jacket on backwards, asking for aspirin as if we'd never met. She flinched at my confused expression and whispered, "I think I already did this." That was when I caught my own reflection in the window, and for a heartbeat the image did not move as I did. It blinked 2 beats after I did, forehead creased in an unfamiliar way, mouth shaping some silent word. My skin crawled. I placed my hand on the glass. The reflection didn't move. For the briefest moment, the fear wasn't just the circumstances, but the certainty that I was no longer the only me in that small, empty store. Dawn came late that morning. I reported for inventory, went through the rituals, avoided looking too long at the windows, at the counter, at anything reflecting back at me. In the light of day, everything looked ordinary. Just another small-town gas station, stocked and clean, empty save for the gentle buzz of ballast. But as I counted packs and sorted receipts, the echo wouldn't fade. I've come to believe that some places, especially those clinging to the edge of civilization, fields pressing in, darkness swallowing up the road, are thin. Here, reality doubles, and memory tears at the seams. Maybe loneliness breeds it. Maybe the land remembers things we've all tried to forget. Or maybe, when the right quiet falls, the night tries to balance itself, matching every step you take with one that doesn't quite land where it should. So listen to me. If you find yourself working the graveyard shift in the liminal places, where cornfields press and the only certainty is repetition, trust the little details, the odd feelings, the sense that time has rippled instead of marched. And if you ever spot a face in the window, moving just out of sync, or watch a regular enter twice in different clothes, remember, you might not be alone, even if you're the only one who notices. In those moments, your only guide is your memory. Guard it well. Hold tight to who you are, and don't trust the echo, no matter how harmless it seems. Because sometimes reality doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it wants to drag you along for the ride. And when you finally clock out, if you still remember your own name, count yourself lucky. Whatever stalked the midnight hours decided to leave you whole, at least for one more day.